today we're going to talk about the subject more broadly, and then I'll talk about three different aspects of it. This room filled up quick. Three more aspects of it. Specifically, we'll talk about subsidies for the film industry in North Carolina, sports stadium subsidies, which seems to be a trendy sort of thing at the local government level, and then actual corporate incentives, which we hear, we get a lot of different headlines about in the news, particularly with Amazon seeking a new headquarters somewhere else in the United States that's not Seattle. But first, I'm the state director with Americans for Prosperity. We're a 501c4 nonprofit organization. We exist to recruit, educate, and mobilize citizens in support of the policies and goals of a free and open society. We fight at the local, state, and federal level, helping every American live their dream, especially the least fortunate. Now, I'm not going to read the rest of you, but we talk about, the title of this talk is Reverse Robin Hood. And what does that mean? That doesn't mean to reverse Robin Hood. What we've done in North Carolina is we've turned the idea of Robin Hood and spun it all the way around and twisted its meaning drastically. Robin Hood is known in common speech. We talk about it. Robin Hood robbing the rich to give to the poor, right? Well, it's not exactly what Robin Hood did. It just happens to be that the rich people in the day were the government. And so he robbed the government and gave the money back to the poor. But we've reversed that in modern day North Carolina and in America. We do this a lot at the federal level, where we take from taxpayers, and everybody pays taxes. They pay, from the least fortunate up to the wealthy, they pay sales taxes, they pay income taxes, they pay use taxes, they pay property taxes, they pay all kinds of taxes. And then our governments, for whatever reason, have decided that it is okay to take some of that tax money that when you pay it, you assume that you're paying for things like the highway patrol, roads, schools, water and sewer infrastructure, teachers, textbooks, judges, that sort of thing. But instead, we are giving money back to corporations, which is well outside of the scope of government. They are outside of the core functions of government. So let's talk about our terms. Let's define our terms before we get into the definition. Now, the term corporate welfare was coined by Ralph Nader, obviously stalwart conservative, back in, I believe, 1956. And he wanted to draw attention to the idea that we have welfare, safety net programs, and then we have rich corporations. And there are a lot of subsidies going to corporations at that time and still today. And so he called it corporate welfare to draw attention to the idea. It makes a lot of sense. The corporate welfare we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about some direct subsidies, tax loopholes. People like to call those credits and deductions if they're trying to talk you into it. And if they're saying they're terrible, they call them loopholes. And then there are also just tax rebates, which is a different sort of thing. It's a different form of actual tax loophole, but it has to do with the refundability of it and the direct payments back to you. But all those things boil down to that nice little funnel and spool around, and we come out with what we're going to define for the terms of this conversation as corporate welfare. Now, the question is, do we have corporate welfare in North Carolina? I know that some of you who keep up with it are like, yeah, we've got some stuff. We've got the film subsidies, and we've got JDIG, and we do a lot of stuff. Folks, we've got a lot of programs in North Carolina, and this isn't even all of them. I just ran out of space. We've got the Film and Entertainment Grant, we've got JDIG, we've got JMAC, we've got local business incentives at local governments that I think the Locke Foundation did a study on that back in 2014 or 2015 you should check out. We've got the One North Carolina Fund, which is not to be confused with the One North Carolina Small Business Fund. Why we have two of them, I don't know. We've got sales tax exemptions for research and development. We've got a rail industrial access program. If you're a manufacturer and you're close to a rail site and you need to ship out on a rail, the state will pay for the rails to be built to your manufacturing site. I didn't know that even existed. We've got a renewable energy investment tax credit. We've got the renewable portfolio standard, which I talked about the last time I was here, where it's a little bit different of a program where we all are actually forced to buy a particular product, renewable energy that is, and then pay an additional fee at the end of our power bill, which isn't really in the tax code, but it functions essentially as a tax, even if the money isn't going to the government. There's another solar energy rebate program that was just enacted this past legislative session. And then, of course, we have sports stadium subsidies, which seems to be the really cool thing to do if you're in Charlotte or High Point. Raleigh doesn't really have that problem. They tried to do that in Fayetteville and then in Wilmington a few years ago as well, and we'll talk about that. So like I said, we're going to talk about three different forms. We're going to talk about film subsidies, then we're going to talk about sports stadium subsidies and the rise of that and why that exists. Actually, I don't know that I can answer why it exists, but we'll talk about it. And then we're going to really get into and spend a little bit more time into the corporate incentive programs that we have here in North Carolina. Hopefully that'll leave some time for some discussion at the end. So film subsidies. This is a subject near and dear to John Sanders' heart. Where is John Sanders? There he is. John Sanders has done a lot of work here at the John Locke Foundation writing about the corporate welfare generally, but particularly the film subsidies he's really sunk his teeth into over the past few years. Back in 2005, North Carolina started a tax credit program, which was essentially a sales tax rebate program for film production here in North Carolina. They would get a 25% rebate on sales taxes that film productions had where they produced in North Carolina. So when they had to buy lumber to build the sets or pipes or buy food or whatever, they would get a 25% rebate on the taxes they paid. All right, now that changed back in 2014 when the General Assembly changed that over to the North Carolina Film and Entertainment Grant Program. So instead of making it an uncapped tax credit, because you can't really constitutionally cap a tax credit, but I think at its highest year in 2011, 2012, they were paying out $86 million a year in that program. So they created a grant program. Now, there are a lot of the tax purists, I'm using quotes on that one, at the General Assembly who say that a grant program is better than a tax credit program. And their argument is that you can't cap a tax credit. There's no way to talk or to figure out how much you will have to pay out in the rebates and the tax credits the following year. The problem is that when you go to a grant program, it's not really any better because now the government is literally picking the winners and the losers, which programs get money and which ones don't. The way the program works, it is in fact a direct subsidy against a payment, but it's 25% of the spending for that project, the overall spending for that project in North Carolina. It's $30 million a year. Currently, they have some rollover funding, and so they are actually up to $34 million they can spend in the 2018 or 2017-18 fiscal year. But unfortunately, in the budget this year, even though it was overall a very good budget with the largest tax cut in state history, they changed this line item in the budget so that instead of being non-recurring and they had to approve it every budget cycle, it is now a recurring item in the budget cycle. So they're just going to spend this money over and over again. Now, there was a fail-safe, and still is, I guess technically, of that sunset, so that the program conceivably, there's nothing quite so permanent as a temporary government program, right? But the program would conceivably go away July 1st of 2020. Well, the technical corrections bill that just passed the General Assembly last week in the special legislative session did away with the sunset. Now, we're still waiting to see, and I'm in the awkward position of having to put out a release and ask Governor Cooper to do something for me. But we asked Governor Cooper to veto the bill because it got rid of the sunset. Now, what does that mean if they get rid of the sunset? So not only is it a recurring item in the budget every year, now there is no sunset on it. And so they're not going to come back and at least check and see if the program is any good or not in 2020. They're not going to check themselves. They're not going to check and see if it needs to be augmented. For that matter, even if you're a proponent of it, they're not even going to see if it needs to be grown or not. They're just going to spend this blindly here on out if they get rid of that sunset. Now, there's a per cap, or there's a project, per project cap on all these things, what they'll do for a TV series, a feature-length film, and television commercials. But here's the thing. And this is a perfectly viable scenario somewhere in North Carolina right now. Let's say I'm a single mother in southeast Raleigh. I'm working every day at my job, working really hard to make ends meet with my 2 kids at home. I could use just a little bit more in my paycheck, or not more in my paycheck if at least the sales tax on my grocery bill or my Walmart bill just wasn't quite so high. I don't need a handout. I just need just a little bit more of the money that I earn. And then I leave work and I go to a PTA meeting and I find out that my son is having to share a textbook because there's a textbook shortage at our school. And on top of that, the school is already out of copy paper and they're trying to see if they can get money from the PTA to buy more copy paper. And it's just October. And then I go home tonight and I turn on WNCN or WRL or Spectrum News, and I find out that the state of North Carolina is spending $30 million a year on movies, on television shows. I don't think, it doesn't take, a rocket surgeon to figure out that this is not within the core functions of government. Nowhere near in the core functions of government. And it's inappropriate at a time when there are actually core functions of government that need more funding. The problem is that not that the General Assembly is spending too little money in the budget, it's that their priorities are wrong. They're absolutely wrong. And Governor Cooper's not helping that along at all. It's a bad return on investment. John Sanders made this, told you you'd get a shout out, made this graph a couple of years ago talking about returns on the dollar that we get for investing in film subsidies. Now, the film industry will tell you that they make millions of dollars back into the North Carolina economy, and how they prove that, I'm not really sure. They have some of these economic impact studies. Dr. Roy Cordato actually put out a piece last year, I think, that talked about why economic impact studies are terrible, if you would like to read that at the John Locke Foundation. But in North Carolina, as of 2013, and this was under the tax credit, not the grant, but it's essentially the same program, North Carolina was getting back 19 cents on the dollar. But, one, I think we can all agree 19 cents on the dollar is a bad investment. But let's assume it was $1.50 on the dollar. Let's assume we were making money back. If it's such a good investment, and that's how we hear about these things, if it's such a good investment, then why doesn't the state of North Carolina create its own film entity? Why don't we start producing movies? If the point is to create jobs and bring money back into the state, and film is such a good investment, then why doesn't the General Assembly simply pass a bill that creates, North Carolina Works Films or something like that? It's because it's inappropriate use of taxpayer money. Here's another scenario. What if Al Gore comes in and wants to create an Inconvenient Truth 3? And he wants to film it in North Carolina. You've paid for it, and you've paid for it, and you've paid for it, and you've paid for it. Do you feel like your free speech rights have been violated if you're having to pay for things that are outside of what you believe? Yet the government made this decision for you, and you're literally having to pay for Al Gore's terrible, terrible documentary. Things we have to consider. Let's look at Iron Man 3. It's my favorite example. Iron Man 3 was filmed in a large part of North Carolina, not solely in North Carolina. At the time of its release, it was the 5th highest grossing film of all time. It's now fallen to 12th, which still ain't bad if you consider all the movies that have been released. It grossed $1.2 billion internationally at the box office. $1.2 billion. And yet, when you go to the State Film Office website, they will proudly proclaim that North Carolina gave Iron Man 3 $20 million in support through state tax incentives. If they grossed $1.2 billion, why do they need $20 million of your and my money? Why? Now, what the film people will tell you is, well, if we don't pay them, then they'll go to Georgia or they'll go to Louisiana. Georgia is spending somewhere between $300 and $450 million every year on film incentives. If Georgia wants to go bankrupt because of film, then let Georgia do that. But everybody else is doing it too is not a good excuse. At the risk of sounding like my mother, if all your friends jumped off a bridge, would you jump off the bridge too? It's silly. It's absolutely silly. And they clearly didn't need our money. Stadium subsidies. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one because it doesn't make a lot of sense, and two, there's just not a lot of information to be had. But this picture over here is a rendering of the multi-use High Point Stadium, the Catalyst project that they're trying to put out in High Point. Currently, we have a movement in North Carolina where local governments are trying to pay for the construction of subsidies. Charlotte is trying to currently fund a Major League Soccer team expansion. They're trying to either buy a stadium outright with taxpayer money or build a new one. Fayetteville used taxpayer money to build a minor league stadium down there just last year, a year before. High Point is currently putting money out there to build a stadium and buy like 600 acres around downtown High Point. And then on top of that, they're also asking the Guilford County Commission to chip in another $15 million on top of that. Wilmington decided they wanted to build a stadium, or the city council decided they wanted to build a stadium back in 2012. That was an awkward sort of thing. That was a terrible scenario altogether. That was, they were going to spend $32 million to build a minor league stadium in downtown Wilmington, right there on the waterfront. Great location. I don't think anybody argues with that. But the city was going to take out a bond and then raise taxes to pay for the bond, to pay for the stadium. They would be paying on the bond for 40 years. But the deal they had worked out with the minor league team that was going to come is that after 15 years, the team would own the stadium outright. So 25 years after the town had ceased owning the stadium, they were going to continue to pay for the bond, all in the name of economic development. The Atlanta Braves don't need our money. If the Atlanta Braves want to build a stadium somewhere, they can. If the Cincinnati Reds want to build a stadium somewhere, they can. If Major League Soccer wants to build a stadium somewhere, they can. But they don't need our money, and it's a gross misuse of taxpayer money, either at the local level or the state level. This is a trend that we can continue watching. I know Julie Tisdale has done some work here at the John Locke Foundation on local government work. But this thing going on in High Point is crazy. There are even some members of the High Point City Council who are mad at the Guilford County Commission because the Guilford County Commission hasn't said yes yet, and so they're on their social media accounts talking about how they actually want to secede from Guilford County and create a whole nother county called Piedmont County. I'm not kidding. The Rhino Times has a whole story on it. It's bizarre. But yeah, all because they desperately need a baseball stadium in High Point. Which I would argue that if High Point would just lower some of their property taxes and get rid of that very high local sales and use tax, then perhaps they would bring more businesses back in downtown. But no, they want a baseball stadium, and Nito Cobain, the president of High Point University, is raising $50 million for it. But if he can raise $50 million for it, I don't know why he can't raise the other $30 million that he's asking taxpayers to pay for it as well. All right. Now, y'all, this is the fun part. I need you to buckle in and get down with me here. Governor Cooper and corporate incentives. All right. So we have a governor here in North Carolina who spent all of 2016 and then the first part of this year talking about corporate tax giveaways, and corporate tax giveaways, and how they're bad. They're absolutely evil for the state. If you go back to his campaign site when he was a candidate, he says, while some of the biggest companies, including out-of-state corporations, have received tremendous giveaways, many of our small businesses and working families have seen tax increases, sometimes disguised as fees. And then, as he was campaigning, just about a year ago, October 13th of last year in the Wilmington Star, he says, we do not need to raise taxes. We need to stop continuing corporate tax giveaways and put more money in the pockets of middle-class families. I'm down. Let's do it. Sign me up. Great. Let's do that. I absolutely agree, Governor. And then in just January of this year, as the General Assembly was coming into session, and this is an article in the News and Observer about how he was going to sort of go at loggerheads with some members of some of the leadership of the General Assembly. It says the key is making sure we can pay for it, talking about his education agenda. Further corporate tax giveaways will put us in the position where we can't. Are we going to invest in education and our people, or are we going to continue further corporate tax giveaways? Corporate tax giveaways, corporate tax giveaways, ad nauseum. And even when we passed a budget at the General Assembly and he was going to veto it, he put out this nice little tweet. Isn't Twitter a nice thing where you can find out what your public officials think? Thank you, President Trump. Tax giveaways to corporations and the wealthiest will punch a hole in our budget. This is not a fiscally responsible budget. Corporate tax giveaways. Tax giveaways to corporations. All right, so we clearly know how the governor feels. No corporate tax giveaways. We don't want any corporate tax giveaways at all. I think he's very clear about that. He's been very, very clear about that over the last year. Well, at the governor's discretion, there are two corporate incentive programs. You have JDIG, the Jobs Development Investment Grant. It's a performance-based discretionary, which means the executive branch has the discretion to use it or not. incentive program that provides cash grants directly to new and expanding companies to help offset the cost of locating or expanding a facility in the state. And he also has, to a smaller extent, but similar, the One North Carolina Fund. It's a discretionary cash grant program that allows the governor to respond quickly to competitive job creation projects. The North Carolina Department of Commerce administers the One North Carolina Fund on behalf of the governor. These descriptions are directly off the Department of Commerce website. These are not my fanciful writings or anything like that. This is how the Department of Commerce describes the programs itself. Now, we've seen what the governor thinks, and we also know that these can be used at his discretion. He can choose to invest in these programs or use these programs or not. Since Roy Cooper has come into office in January of 2017, he has signed away $125,835,000 in corporate incentives just in those two programs, just One North Carolina and JDIG. What happened to we don't want any more corporate tax giveaways? So, in the vein of we don't want any more corporate tax giveaways yet, and we want middle-class families to have more money in their pockets, and yet we have $125 million that North Carolina is now on the hook for. Contracts have been signed. We are on the hook over the next 10 to 12 years for $125 million. He's turned into the reverse Robin Hood. He is literally taking from poor families in southeast Raleigh and East Durham and Hyde County and Scotland County and Macon County, North Carolina, and he is giving to large corporations to expand or move into North Carolina. You can check it out. It's a website we launched today, ReverseRobinHoodcom. Generation Opportunity, which is a project of Americans for Prosperity, will be launching a website later today or tomorrow called DuckDuckCooper.com. Much like when you play Duck, Duck, Goose, you just get to pick whoever you want. And Roy Cooper is clearly picking winners and losers. If you look at what he's done, this didn't take a FOIA request. This information can all be gleaned from the Department of Commerce website. You go to their press releases section where they proudly proclaim everything that they're going to do for North Carolina. If you look, there are 40 different deals that have been signed, starting, the first one was on January 24th, 2017. He didn't take very long to get started. And this is all, again, just One North Carolina and JDIG funds. It's not, there are other programs he could access, but this is just One North Carolina and JDIG. There are 40 different deals that he's inked in corporate tax giveaways, he being Governor Cooper, since he came into office. They represent 25 counties. Let's highlight a few. Let's talk about them. My favorite one to talk about, and the one that I think is the biggest tragedy, is to credit Suisse. Now, this all came, you'll remember, right after the House Bill 2 compromise came through, and the General Assembly passed it and came through, and then like 2-3 days after, Governor Cooper came out and there was this Credit Suisse deal. We've got a Swiss bank coming in, or actually already in RTP, and they're going to expand by 1,200 jobs, and this is all because we signed the House Bill 2 compromise. They would be stupid not to sign this deal. First off, it is $40.2 million in incentives over the next 12 years for only a $70 million investment from the company. The incentives make up more than half of the investment. It was to create 1,200 jobs. That comes out to about $33,500 per job. By far, by the way, of all the deals you'll see on the website, or the ones I've just talked about, that is the highest per job that you will see, far and away, $33,000 per job. But did Credit Suisse really come here because of House Bill 2, or did they come because it was such a good deal? One, we're paying for more than half of their investment in incentives. Two, it takes a simple Google search to figure out Credit Suisse is like circling the bowl. They are closing down offices all along the Pacific Rim. They've lost billions of dollars, and they've been instructed by their board. And guys, this is stuff that I've just gotten off of a Google search. There are New York Times articles, Wall Street Journal articles that detail all of this. Their board has said that they need to build up $1.5 billion by the end of 2018 in reserve funds. They are losing money. They are creating 1,200 jobs over the next 10 years, 120 jobs per year in North Carolina. Yet, they are going to fire between the years of 2016 and 17, they are firing around 16,000 people worldwide. He bailed out a bank. He's got a bank that is in a bad way. They're having to reorganize. The last time they got an incentive deal, which they did to move to North Carolina, this is an expansion, they did it in the Easley administration. Then you've got another bank who needs a lot of help. He's holding them off until they sign a House Bill 2 compromise, and then he gives them $40 million. But you know what? We'll pay for more than half your investment just to expand an RTP. Roy Cooper bailed out a bank. Then we've got Infosys. Remember how he talked about all those out-of-state corporations? Well, this is an out-of-country corporation. First off, he gave money to a Swiss bank, which is the deal we talked about before. There are plenty enough jokes to be made about the fact that we are giving money to a bank, a Wall Street traded foreign bank. Leave that alone. Infosys is an Indian-owned company. Now, I don't have any problems. I'm with Americans for Prosperity. I'm for prosperity everywhere. But if you're going to come out with your bare face hanging out, as my grandmother would say, and say something about out-of-state corporations, then you give how much money? $22.4 million in incentives to a company that's not even headquartered in the country? Come on. Oh, by the way, the investment from the company is only $8.7 million, which means that we're coming close to just tripling their investment in just incentives. They're profiting off of incentives alone, not to mention the fact that they're a for-profit company. They're going to make money anyway. It's like giving money to Iron Man 3. It's ridiculous. It's going to create 2,000 jobs. Comes out to about $11,200 per job. Now, $33,000 per job, $11,200 per job. You'll figure this out once you look at the website pretty quickly that the amount that we pay per job doesn't make a lot of sense. They provide criteria if you dig deeper into the Department of Commerce website and the Economic Partnership website. And a lot of it has to do with offsetting the personal income taxes of the workers of the jobs that they're going to create, combined with the tier of the county that's going to come in, combined with what type of jobs. It's all an amalgam of things that don't make a lot of sense, and it really just tells you that it is truly discretionary how much we give these companies. It is completely up to the Department of Commerce and Governor Cooper how much we give to these different companies. But $125 million in the scope of a $23 billion a year budget doesn't sound like that much. But it's still $125 million over the next 10 years. How much could we cut small business taxes? How much, Becky Gray, how much could we have just cut the franchise tax entirely? How much more could we cut the corporate income tax? Probably not entirely, but we could have cut it more where we treat every business the same. How much could we have cut, I don't know, a little bit off of the state sales tax? How much could we have cut off of the income tax? How much more could we have increased your standard deduction? And instead, we've got $125 million that we're on the hook for off of Roy Cooper giving away to politically connected companies. That's fine. Tell him I said hi. But if you think he's stopping at $125 million, which, by the way, this is $125 million 9 months in to a 4-year term. Do that math. The next thing is he's willing to give more. Triangle Business Journal covered it. He wanted to give $540 million to one company. He wanted to give it to Foxconn. How many of you have an iPhone? Clearly he does. That's fine. Now, Foxconn makes components for iPhones and BlackBerries and iPads and all that sort of thing. Huge company. They make most of it in China, but they wanted to expand to the United States. They came down to 2 states they were looking to expand into. One was North Carolina, the other one was Wisconsin. Triangle Business Journal did a public records request, $540 million, which would have been a JDIG grant, which spread out over 10 years. That's $54 million a year. That's significant. That is significant government spending. Or $570 million, not $540 million. What we lost out to, and thankfully we're not from Wisconsin, was a $3 billion incentive package from the state of Wisconsin, which as good as Scott Walker has been to Wisconsin, he failed epically on that one. Also, by the way, he helped pay for to give the Milwaukee Bucks a new arena. Somebody needs to talk to Scott Walker about corporate welfare. But here's the scary part, and this is what really got me going on this. I was already curious about the Credit Suisse stuff, and it didn't sound right, and I'd been looking at that for a while. But then Amazon came out. Amazon wanted to come in, and they want to create a second headquarters somewhere else in the United States. And I start seeing op-eds in the Charlotte Observer about how Charlotte is the place for Amazon HQ2. And then you see hashtag Amazon HQ2 all over Twitter. And then the governor comes out and talks about how North Carolina is a great place to be. And then I see members of the General Assembly, Republicans and Democrats, both parties are absolutely culpable in this, talk about how Amazon should move to North Carolina. This would be a gigantic incentive. I've talked to people from Site Selection Magazine, talked to some reporters. The incentive package is going to have to be somewhere between $500 million to $1 billion. It's going to have to be a monster. The economic development world, people who work in that would call this a whale. And this is a whale of a whale if they wanted to come in here. North Carolina sweetened the pot for Amazon-sized jobs and spending because we put in a mega sites fund in our state budget, so that not only are we going to give them a JDIG grant if they want to move into North Carolina, we'll also just buy the land for them. Up to $20 million. Just straight up buy real estate. Now, we have these economic development programs, economic development, because we want to make sure that all North Carolinians are treated equally. We want to see economic development all across the state. And so the Department of Commerce has created this nice little tier system where the 20 most economically depressed counties are Tier 1 counties, counties where you should really push the One North Carolina and JDIG projects. And then you have the next 40 are Tier 2, and the 20 least economically depressed, and there shouldn't be any surprise about where these counties are Tier 3. So Wake County, Mecklenburg County, they're Tier 3. Scotland County, Tyrrell County, Bladen County, they're Tier 1. Make sense? Make sense, everybody? All right, now this is the map from the Department of Commerce, not one that I constructed off. If you look at the deals that Governor Cooper has inked since he came into office, 80% of them are going to Tier 3 counties. The counties that absolutely don't need them. Those also happen to be the most politically connected counties, don't they? They happen to be where the seat of government is. They happen to be where the most legislators are from. They happen to be where the most donors are from. So why, when we talk about, and you hear this a lot around Raleigh, where you talk about the rural-urban divide in North Carolina. Now, I'm not, any good economist will tell you it's really hard to find out what causation is. And I'm not saying there is causation, and I'm not saying I'm an economist, but I'm not saying there is causation between the rural-urban divide in North Carolina. But what I do know is that JDIG and One North Carolina and these corporate welfare programs that Governor Cooper is signing are in fact incentivizing jobs away from rural North Carolina. I mean, it's not even close. Tier 1 counties get 2% of the funding. It's not even close. Now, admittedly, they don't always have airports, they don't always have roads and things like that. But if I'm a major manufacturer wanting to move into North Carolina, the first thing I want is cheap land. The second thing I want is labor who can do the job. We have community colleges who can do training all across the state. We have that infrastructure. We have the educational infrastructure. And so where's cheap land? Usually in Tier 1, Tier 2 counties. Why are we making them buy land in Wake County? Why are we making them buy land in Forsyth County in downtown Winston-Salem? It doesn't make any sense. The reason it doesn't make any sense is because they are going to where they are the most politically connected and where it makes the most political difference. Where can I get headlines? Where can I cut a ribbon? Where can I get my picture in the paper? You want to break that down even further, Wake County is this giant orange thing right here. Mecklenburg County is the other 24%. The other 98 counties get this. These programs are not being distributed equally. They're not being treated fairly. He's clearly giving it away to companies that are the most absolutely politically connected. So when people say, people in Nash County are hurting, you're right. There's a reason that some counties in North Carolina are losing people, because we're incentivizing people to move to Tier 3 counties. We're incentivizing them to move to Mecklenburg County, incentivizing them to move to Wake County. No wonder Wake County is growing so fast. So, as we wrap up, and maybe we have a little bit of discussion, here are some things to consider. Corporate welfare programs are, in fact, government spending, period. The government is somehow cutting a check. Even if it's a tax credit, government is cutting a check, which takes out of the amount of revenue that we have. Second, the only way to win the film incentive game, because a lot of states are playing it. What's it grown from, John? 4 states back in 2000 to 44 states now that have film incentives?
44 in 2009, and since then 10 have gotten out.
Okay, so we're back down to 34. 34 states are in this game. The only way to win it is to not play. They say they're happy with 30 million, and they're always afraid of us going to Georgia, but Georgia's given up how many? Hundreds of millions? Like, I'm not kidding, hundreds of millions of dollars in this. They're not happy with 30 million. Next they're going to ask for 40, and then 80, and then 100. People want the money. They want taxpayer money. And the only way for us to win is to not play at all. Either we're a state that people want to come to, or we're not. Either we're a low-tax, attractive state that people want to come to, or we're not. But this whole extortion business is silly, and we need to stop playing with tariffs. How many of you noticed when we ended the tax credit program a few years ago, there was a huge story, and I got called by several reporters because of it, about how all of these productions that were in Wilmington moved like overnight, literally like within 2 or 3 days, they moved out and moved to Atlanta. And reporters called me just in a tease, like, oh my gosh, how do you feel about all these jobs leaving North Carolina? And I said, well, one, I think it's unfortunate that jobs are leaving North Carolina. Any job, whether it's a film job or a furniture factory job, whatever job is good for North Carolina. But if they can move that fast, what does that say about how much they've invested in our state? How much have they actually invested in infrastructure in our state if they can literally pick up and move that fast? They haven't. They haven't invested in our state at all. That's why they can pick up and move. And if they'll come here for the money, they'll leave here for the money. Incentive programs, corporate incentive programs such as JDIG and the One North Carolina Fund, keep tax rates needlessly higher for all taxpayers. $125 million, $570 million. That's $125 million that Governor Cooper, as much as he wanted to spend in his proposed budget, was okay with North Carolina. That's $125 million in revenue that Governor Cooper was okay with North Carolina doing without. That was $125 million that the General Assembly was okay with North Carolina doing without over the next 10 years. Why can't, if cutting those taxes, if reducing the tax burden of those companies will create jobs, which they concede, people who want these incentives concede that lowering taxes create jobs, then why can't we just cut taxes by $125 million for everyone? See, the tax code needs 2 things. It needs to have a low rate, it needs to have a broad base, and the thing it actually needs to do is pay for the core functions of government. Now, we can argue about what those core functions are, but we can't really have that discussion until we clean up the tax code. And this sort of mess really mucks up the tax code. We can't get anything fixed as long as we're giving away $40 million to Swiss banks to expand an RTP. We can't really clean up the tax code or figure out actually what government spending is as long as we're giving $30 million a year to Hollywood that really only benefits, New Hanover County down in Wilmington. Incentive programs are not the cause of, but in fact are contributing to the economic disparity between rural and urban North Carolina. We are incentivizing people to not go to rural North Carolina. We are incentivizing people to move out of rural counties and into urban counties. And when we try to figure out why that's happening, one of the answers, and I think there are a lot of answers to that, but one of the answers is absolutely government has messed up the market signals for jobs through JDIG and One North Carolina, through JMAC, through film, and all of these incentive programs. So I urge you to go to ReverseRobinHoodcom if you want to look at the numbers yourself. If you want to email the governor and tell him to stop this. But Governor Cooper, while the website is targeted at Governor Cooper, members of the General Assembly should also be absolutely on notice. We'll hold them accountable too. And this conversation we're going to continue to have at the General Assembly. But I think we've got a few minutes. I'm open to take any questions anybody might have.